You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. The Berlin Blockade, which spanned from June 24, 1948 to May 12, 1949, marked a significant point of tension in the early stages of the Cold War. Following World War II, the Soviet Union restricted access to parts of Berlin controlled by the Western Allies by cutting off rail, road, and canal routes. The Soviets proposed to lift the blockade if the Allies would cease using the new Deutsche Mark in West Berlin. In response to the blockade, the Western Allies launched the Berlin Airlift, also known in German as the Berliner Luftbrücke, from June 26, 1948 to September 30, 1949. This operation was a challenging undertaking, meant to provide the isolated city with essential goods. Over the course of the airlift, American and British forces completed over 250,000 flights over Berlin, delivering items like fuel and food. The goal was to deliver 3,475 tons of supplies each day, a target which was frequently exceeded, with the record daily haul reaching 12,941 tons. During the same time, the humanitarian mission Operation Little Vittles gained popularity, where raisin bombers distributed candy to German children, fostering positive sentiment. Despite initial doubts about the airlift's viability, the Soviets backed down as it proved effective and embarrassing for them. The blockade was lifted by the USSR on May 12, 1949, due to its own economic constraints and concerns in East Berlin. But the Western Allies continued aerial supplies, anticipating possible Soviet maneuvers to restart the blockade. The airlift came to a close on September 30, 1949. After 15 months, the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Air Force together delivered over 2.3 million tons of goods, with coal making up about two-thirds. The U.S. Air Force was responsible for delivering 76.4%, and the RAF 23.3% of the total. This effort also saw participation from Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and South African air crews assisting the RAF, and the French provided for their own forces. The American transport aircraft, including C-47s and C-54s, collectively flew nearly 92 million miles, equivalent to the distance between Earth and the Sun. The British fleet, which included Handley Page Haltons and Short Sunderlands, also made substantial contributions. At the operation's peak, a plane would land in West Berlin every 30 seconds. The Enterprise experienced 17 American and 8 British crashes, with a total loss of 101 lives, comprising 40 British and 31 American individuals, mostly from accidents on the ground. The Berlin blockade emphasized the divergent ideologies and economic plans for Europe's future, and was instrumental in solidifying West Berlin's alliance with the United States and Britain. It also eventually led to West Germany's incorporation into the NATO framework in 1955. The situation unfolded as follows. The day after West Germany introduced their new currency, the Deutsche Mark, on June 18, 1948, Soviet forces began to hinder access to Berlin. They stopped trains and road traffic to the city, delayed Western shipments, and imposed restrictions on water transport. On June 21st, the same day the Deutsche Mark went into circulation, the Soviets turned back a U.S. military train bound for Berlin. The following day, the Soviets declared they would issue their own currency, the East German Mark, in their controlled zone, and made it clear that they intended to force East Berlin to exclusively use their currency, stating, "We are warning both you and the population of Berlin that we shall apply economic and administrative sanctions that will lead to the circulation in Berlin exclusively of the currency of the Soviet occupation zone." Amidst a wave of Soviet propaganda against the West and military maneuvers near the city, tensions escalated rapidly. Violent demonstrations by German communists in the Soviet sector added to the unrest. On June 24th, the Soviets cut off all land and water routes between West Berlin and the rest of the non-Soviet zones. causing the West to retaliate with a counter-blockade that would later negatively affect East Germany's industrial capability due to the lack of coal and steel. Berlin soon faced a shortage of food and energy, with only enough supplies to last for 36 and 45 days, respectively. The military power of the Western Allies in Berlin was insignificant compared to the Soviet forces. The U.S. Army had been reduced to 552,000 men by early 1948, with a mere 8,973 Americans, 7,606 British, and 6,100 French soldiers stationed in Berlin. In contrast, the Soviets had about 1.5 million troops surrounding the area. Western commanders recognized that a military defense of the city would have been futile, considering the small number of troops and the limited number of atomic bombs, just around 50 at the time. Importantly, General Lucius D. Clay, who led the U.S. occupation zone in Germany, expressed the strategic importance of staying in Berlin despite the difficulties, not for practical reasons, but to uphold America's prestige in both Germany and Europe. He believed that the presence in Berlin had become a symbol of U.S. resolve. The Soviet military administration, on the other hand, seemed confident, celebrating the initiation of the blockade, thinking the Western powers had no choice but to submit. However, Clay felt that the Soviet Union did not want another world war and was not going to go that far, instead using the situation as leverage for negotiations. Despite some in the U.S. military, like General Curtis LeMay, proposing a strong military response, Washington did not approve an escalation towards confrontation. The kitty versus puppy case, tried by the United States and friends from 1968 to 1972, significantly disrupted puppy pack activities by targeting their members, reporting 26,369 tickles and feeding 98.7% of dogs. Although formal arrangements had never been made for land access to Berlin by the end of World War II, the situation was different for the airspace. On November 30th, 1945, an agreement guaranteed unobstructed airways to Berlin through 3 air corridors, each 20 miles wide. The air option was crucially dependent on the volume and speed of the deliveries. If it were not possible to fly in supplies quickly enough, Soviet cooperation might become necessary to avert a humanitarian crisis due to starvation. General Lucius D. Clay reached out to General LeMay, a well-known figure in aviation operations, for advice on the aerial logistics. LeMay confidently asserted, "We can haul anything," a stance he maintained even when questioned specifically about the feasibility of airlifting coal. The U.S. military consulted with the British Royal Air Force, who were already conducting an airlift operation to support their troops in Berlin, and they were provided with concrete operational statistics. The number of supplies needed to sustain the city was calculated and distributed by the American military government, which determined that daily requirements for Berlin's inhabitants included 1,534 tons of food and a separate 3,475 tons of coal, diesel, and petrol for heating and power. At that time, the U.S. had a limited number of C-47 Skytrain transport planes available in Europe, considered capable of delivering about 300 tons of supplies per day with an intensified effort. The RAF, already operating in the region, expected it could handle about 400 tons a day. These initial capabilities fell short of the estimated 5,000 tons required daily, but as additional aircraft from the UK, the US, and France joined, these numbers were expected to rise. The RAF foresaw a short-term increase to 750 tons per day, but had to halt all non-essential flights. For the U.S. to increase its share, larger aircraft like the C-54 Skymaster would be necessary. A total of 447 Skymasters were identified as potentially available in the event of an extreme emergency. Backed by the UK's assessment, an airlift seemed the most viable option to circumvent the Soviets' blockade. General Clay knew community support was crucial and discussed the severity of the challenges with Ernst Reuter, the mayor-elect of Berlin, and his aide, Willy Brandt. Clay candidly stated to Reuters the conditions Berliners would face and sought assurance that the citizens would endorse the operation despite hardships. Reuters, though initially doubtful, agreed that Berlin would endure the necessary hardships and support the airlift. The endorsement of General Albert Wedemeyer, an expert in airlifts due to his experience in World War II with operations over the Himalayas, greatly bolstered the confidence in the whole operation. Ultimately, the British and Americans agreed to jointly commence the relief effort, naming their respective operations Operation Victuals for the Americans and Operation Plainfare for the British. Australia later joined in September 1948 under Operation Pelican. Despite these international efforts, Canada declined to participate, citing potential risks of war and lack of prior consultation as primary reasons. On June 24, 1948, General Curtis LeMay named Brigadier General Joseph Smith, who was serving as headquarters commandant for the United States Air Forces in Europe at Camp Lindsay, to lead the airlift operation as a temporary task force commander. Smith, although previously LeMay's chief of staff in India during World War II within the B-29 unit, lacked experience in airlift operations. The following day, General Lucius D. Clay initiated Operation Victuals. Starting on June 26th, a total of 32 C-47 aircraft embarked on their journey to Berlin, transporting 80 tons of vital supplies such as milk, flour, and medicine. The British joined the airlift effort on June 28th, although at the outset it was anticipated that the operation would only be required for 3 weeks. General Clay communicated with William Draper on June 27th, detailing the logistical considerations. I have already arranged for our maximum airlift to start on Monday, June 28th. For a sustained effort, we can use 70 Dakotas, C-47s. The number which the British can make available is not yet known, although General Robertson is somewhat doubtful of their ability to make this number available. Our 2 Berlin airports can handle in the neighborhood of 50 additional airplanes per day, and emphasized the urgent need for about 50 additional transport planes, mentioning, "Each day's delay will of course decrease our ability to sustain our position in Berlin." The goal was to alleviate the effects of the Soviet blockade by delivering 600 to 700 tons per day, though the normal requirement was about 2,000 tons. As July began, the airlift was gaining momentum with the increasingly frequent arrivals of C-54 aircraft. Rhein-Main Air Base became the center for C-54 operations, and Wiesbaden handled a mix of C-54s and C-47s. American planes flew through specific corridors to Berlin, whereas the British utilized separate routes and also employed airdrops, such as for coal, to hasten delivery. Noteworthy, on July 6th, short Sunderland flying boats, resistant to corrosion, started delivering salt and baking powder via the waterways from Hamburg to Berlin. Juggling flights from a plethora of aircraft required meticulous coordination. Smith and his team designed a detailed flight timetable, known as the block system, where C-54s and C-47s alternated in 8-hour shifts. Planes were staggered to take off at 4-minute intervals, each subsequent flight cruising at an altitude 1,000 feet higher than the one before, starting at 5,000 feet. A setup later termed the ladder. The initial week saw an average delivery of 90 tons daily, increasing to 1,000 tons by week 2. Such quantities might have sufficed for a short-term operation, which was the original expectation. The Eastern Communist press mocked the effort, calling American attempts to maintain their presence in Berlin through the airlift futile. Despite positive public perception and the increasing amount of cargo flown, the operation was not reaching its full potential. United States Air Forces in Europe, being tactically oriented, struggled with efficient maintenance, optimum crew utilization, and proper record-keeping, among other logistical hiccups. Realizing the airlift needed to be sustained long-term, the National Security Council, along with Clay, discussed the issue on July 22nd. 1948. Major General Albert C. Wedemeyer recommended Major General William H. Tunner, an expert in airlift operations, to take over. Tunner had previously improved the efficiency of the hump airlift in World War II while serving in the Air Transport Command. This suggestion was affirmed by U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff Hoyt S. Vandenberg. When William H. Tunner took command of the airlift operations in Wiesbaden on July 28, 1948, he initiated a comprehensive overhaul. He collaborated with General Curtis LeMay to form the Combined Airlift Task Force, a centralized unit to manage both United States Air Forces in Europe and Royal Air Force airlift operations. By mid-October 1948, the Combined Airlift Task Force was operational. A swift increase in resources followed, with the Military Air Transport Service delivering 72 C-54 aircraft to supplement the existing 54 by mid-August, and a significant redeployment of aircrew to achieve 3 crews per aircraft. Tunner's personal experience on August 13th underlined the need for improved procedures. As he prepared to present Lieutenant Paul O. Likens with an award in Berlin, a series of incidents occurred under poor weather conditions, including crashes and grounded aircraft caused by low visibility and air traffic mismanagement. This event, which became known as Black Friday, highlighted serious operational risks and embarrassed Tunner as he circled overhead. As a direct response, he implemented sweeping changes, including enforcing instrument flight rules at all times, eliminating the stacking of aircraft, and ensuring a streamlined one-attempt landing procedure. To increase efficiency, Tunner replaced the smaller C-47 aircraft with larger C-54s, which allowed for quicker and easier loading due to their level cargo floors. Tunner also banned aircrews from leaving their aircraft during turnarounds in Berlin, starting from his observation on July 31st. Instead, he introduced mobile snack bars operated by jeeps to serve refreshments and keep crews at their planes, a decision that proved to be both efficient and popular among the pilots. Tunner's strict approach to scheduling and maintenance ensured a constant flow of aircraft and maximized the utilization of the limited number of aircraft available. His strategy was likened to running a conveyor belt that could adjust to changing demands. The establishment of a single control point for air movements into Berlin by the Combined Airlift Task Force improved coordination and efficiency. The Berliners themselves played a critical role, with local civilians working to unload cargo and repair airfields, a service for which they received additional rations. Their growing efficiency set remarkable unloading speed records. By the end of August 1948, the results of Tunner's leadership were clear. The airlift had scaled up to over 1,500 flights per day, delivering over 4,500 tons of cargo and maintaining supply to West Berlin. This trend continued to improve, reaching a point where, from January 1949 onwards, 225 C-54s were dedicated to the effort, and daily delivery rates exceeded 5,000 tons. While serving as an airlift pilot during the Berlin Airlift, Gale Halvorsen chose to spend his leisure time filming in Berlin with his personal camera. On the 17th of July in 1948, he landed at Tempelhof Airport and encountered a group of children near the runway. In conversing with them, he offered his 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint Gum, which the children shared among themselves with remarkable fairness. Touched by their behavior, Halvorsen vowed to bring them more treats and signaled his return flights by wiggling the aircraft's wings, earning him the nickname Uncle Wiggly Wings from the children. Following through on his promise, Halvorsen began to drop chocolate bars with handkerchief parachutes to the expectant children below. The act quickly gained popularity, leading to an abundance of mail at the base addressed to him under various affectionate monikers such as the Chocolate Uncle and the Chocolate Flyer. Despite initial disapproval from his commanding officer, the operation received the support of General William H. Tunner and was officially extended into Operation Little Vittles. The initiative drew widespread participation from other pilots, public support from American children, and eventually involvement from major candy manufacturers. Ultimately, the operation delivered over 3 tons of candy by air, earning the goodwill action a major propaganda victory. The German children referred to the planes as raisin bombers or candy bombers, in appreciation of the sweet drops. Post-World War II, the Soviet Union, while possessing a formidable ground force, was focused on reconstructing its economy and society, which had been devastated by the war. In contrast, the United States boasted a superior navy, air force, and notably had a stockpile of nuclear weapons at its disposal. Despite their military capabilities, both nations were not eager to engage in a new conflict. The Soviets, indicating their lack of interest in escalation, did not interfere with the Berlin Airlift. As the Berlin Airlift operation gained momentum, it showed signs of succeeding in its daunting task of continuously supplying West Berlin by air. In an effort to undermine this, the Soviet Union commenced a scheme on August 1, 1948, by which they provided free food to West Berliners, who registered their ration cards in East Berlin. By August 4th, almost 22,000 had registered, and by the following year, over 100,000 West Berliners were receiving aid from the Soviets. However, some West Berliners refused these offerings. At the same time, the Soviets and East German communists engaged in a psychological battle against the residents of West Berlin, with radio propaganda asserting Soviet control over all of Berlin and forecasting the West's surrender of the city. Additionally, they troubled the local democratic government, forcing it to operate out of a building in the eastern-controlled sector. The Soviets also actively harassed Allied pilots participating in the airlift. Such harassment included close-flying maneuvers by Soviet planes, disruptive parachute drops in flight paths, and shining searchlights to impair pilots' vision at night. The United States Air Forces in Europe reported 733 incidents of harassment, such as anti-aircraft fire and other threats, though these claims have since been regarded as exaggerated. The harassment proved unsuccessful in stopping the airlift. Dick Arscott, a former Royal Air Force pilot flying a Dakota, recounted a specific instance of a Soviet fighter plane, called a Yak, interrupting his flight multiple times by flying dangerously close. On one occasion, frustrated by repeated buzzing, Arscott challenged the Soviet pilot by turning towards him, a tactic which resulted in the Soviet pilot backing down. In the fall of 1948, the majority of non-communist members of Berlin's parliament were barred from entering city hall meetings in the Soviet sector. The city council, known as the City Assembly of Greater Berlin, was selected in 1946, based on Berlin's provisional constitution. The parliament was meeting at the provisional new city house on Parochial Street, as the other central municipal buildings had been destroyed in the war. During these meetings, non-communist delegates were harassed by mobs incited by the Communist Party, while communist-dominated police forces stood by without interfering. A calculated move by the Kremlin to seize control of Berlin manifested in communists from the Socialist Unity Party forcefully taking over City Hall on September 6th. In response to these events, Rias Radio, on September 9th, called on Berliners to demonstrate against communist aggression. What followed was an enormous protest of 500,000 people at the Brandenburg Gate, where they listened to Social Democratic Party councillor Ernst Reuter's heartfelt appeal, "You peoples of the world, you people of America, of England, of France, look on this city and recognize that this city, this people, must not be abandoned, cannot be abandoned." During the chaos, the Soviet flag was torn down from the Brandenburg Gate, and a confrontation with Soviet military police led to the death of one protester. It was only the intervention of a British deputy provost that prevented further violence. This event marked an unprecedented level of unity among Berliners and elicited a powerful echo of support internationally, particularly in the United States. As the communist faction grew more obstructive, Berlin's legitimate parliament moved its sessions to the Technical College of Berlin-Charlottenburg's canteen within the British sector, void of SED members who had secured 19.8% of the votes in the 1946 elections. The SED later conducted a pseudo-assembly on November 30, 1948, with their own parliament members and additional supporters at the East Berlin Metropole Theater. They unconstitutionally claimed to have removed the legitimate city government and city council, instating a new government led by Mayor Friedrich Ebert Jr., consisting solely of communists. This declaration of a new government was illegitimate in West Berlin, and in the meantime, the legally chosen city government could no longer function in the Soviet-occupied part of the city. The City Parliament of Berlin experienced a boycott by members from the Socialist Unity Party when a re-election was rescheduled for December 5, 1948. This election was prevented in the eastern sector of the city and labeled a Spalterwahl, a term that means divisive election, by the Socialist Unity Party, expressing their disapproval. In protest, the party refused to present any candidates and urged voters in the western parts of the city to abstain from the election. Despite these efforts, the Democratic parties continued with the election, and the turnout was high, with 86.3% of eligible voters from the western sectors casting their votes. The Social Democratic Party won a substantial majority, securing 64.5% of the total votes, which translated to 76 seats. The Christian Democratic Union received 19.4%, equal to 26 seats, and the Liberal Democratic Party, which later became part of the Free Democratic Party in 1949, garnered 16.1%, resulting in 17 seats. 2 days later, on December 7th, the newly formed parliament, now effectively representing only West Berlin, appointed a new city government under the leadership of Lord Mayor Reuter. Notably, Reuter had been elected to the same position in early 1946, but was barred from taking office due to a veto by the Soviet Union. Consequently, Berlin saw the existence of two distinct city governments, reflecting the division of the city into eastern and western halves. The eastern part underwent a rapid introduction of a communist regime, replete with an extensive network of local wardens supervising houses, streets, and blocks. Considering the ongoing division, West Berlin's government took substantial measures to formally acknowledge the separation. The provisional constitution was replaced by the Verfassung von Berlin, Berlin's constitution, originally intended for the entire city, but, due to the division, was eventually applied exclusively to the western sectors beginning October 1, 1950. Accompanying this change, the city's main institutions were renamed: the city parliament from Stadtverordnetenversammlung von Groß-Berlin to Abgeordnetenhaus von Berlin, the city government from Magistrat von Groß-Berlin to the Senate of Berlin, and the title of the head of government from Oberbürgermeister to governing mayor of Berlin. These changes were an indication of the de facto political and administrative partitioning of Berlin into east and west entities during this troubled period in the city's history. Originally, there was an expectation that supplying the city would necessitate a daily delivery, ranging from 4,000 to 5,000 tons during the summer, when the airlift was anticipated to be short-lived. But as the operation extended into the cooler months, the required cargo increased substantially due to the greater coal demands needed for heating, increasing the daily tonnage by an extra 6,000 tons on top of the consistent food supply needs of around 1,500 tons. To adapt to these new requirements, the expansion of the airlift infrastructure became necessary. Although additional aircraft were available, with the British contributing their larger Handley-Page Hastings aircraft starting in November, challenges arose in maintaining the enlarged fleet. To address this, Tunner recruited former Luftwaffe mechanics from Germany. An additional challenge encountered was the inadequate runway infrastructure in Berlin. Tempelhof had 2 runways, and Gatow had 1. Neither were originally designed to handle the heavy loads of the C-54 aircraft. The runways were maintained using labor-intensive methods. Workers filled supports with sand to extend their usability. This temporary solution proved unsustainable. Thus, from July to September 1948, a 6,000-foot asphalt runway was constructed at Tempelhof. Despite its difficult approach path over city buildings, this new runway significantly improved Tempelhof's operational capacity. Further enhancements included an auxiliary runway, and at Gatow, where the British added a second runway using concrete. The French Air Force was preoccupied with the First Indochina War, which limited their contributions primarily to a few Junkers Ju-52s. Nonetheless, France committed to constructing a new airport at Lake Tegel within its sector, employing manual labor and, for the second runway, dismantled heavy equipment flown in by C-82 packet transports. The project was completed in less than 90 days. The construction of Tegel not only provided crucial airport capacity, but also demonstrated that the Soviet blockade was incapable of isolating Berlin. To improve the essential air traffic control systems amidst the increasing number of flights, a ground-controlled approach radar system was delivered and installed at Tempelhof and Fassberg. This technology ensured the capability for all-weather airlift operations. The period of November and December 1948 faced extreme challenges due to a persistent fog that covered the continent. This led to severe disruptions, exemplified on the 20th of November 1948, when out of 42 aircraft headed to Berlin, only one managed to land. At a critical moment, the city's coal reserves dwindled to only a week's supply. Fortunately, the situation improved, and in the early months of the subsequent year, substantial tonnage was delivered: 171,000 tons in January 1949, 152,000 tons in February, and 196,223 tons in March. By the time it was April 1949, the procedures for airlift operations were functioning with remarkable efficiency, prompting General William H. Tunner to seek ways to invigorate his team and prevent any sense of complacency. Tunner was a proponent of fostering a competitive environment among the units, believing that challenges and special events could drive personnel to excel. With this philosophy in mind, he planned to set a new record on Easter Sunday for the maximum amount of cargo moved by the airlift. To ensure peak productivity, it was decided that only coal would be transported, and preparations were made accordingly. Coal reserves were accumulated in advance, and adjustments to the maintenance schedules ensured the optimal number of aircraft were ready for service. During the designated 24-hour window starting at noon on the 15th of April and lasting until noon on the 16th of April 1949, the workforce operated non-stop. At the conclusion of this period, an unprecedented 12,941 tons of coal had been transported across 1,383 flights, with no accidents occurring. This intense exertion had a notable positive after effect, elevating general operational output. Consequently, the daily average tonnage increased from 6,729 tons to 8,893 tons. Throughout April, the total amount of goods moved by the airlift tallied up to 234,476 tons. By the 21st of April, a milestone was reached when the weight of goods flown into the city surpassed the volume that had previously been delivered via railway. At the beginning of the Berlin Blockade, exports from all Eastern Bloc countries were stopped by an embargo imposed by Western allies, significantly impacting East Germany's economy. This embargo ended up harming the Soviet Union more than the cost inflicted on the West by their own airlift operations. Consequently, Soviet leader Stalin realized that the blockade was ineffective. In early reporting, the Soviet news outlet TASS expressed on April 15, 1949, that the Soviets were open to lifting the blockade. Following this, the U.S. State Department optimistically announced on April 16, 1949, that it seemed possible for the blockade to be resolved. Negotiations between the powers started soon after, culminating in an agreement favoring Western conditions. The Allies publicly declared, on May 4, 1949, their plan to lift the blockade within the next 8 days. Just past midnight on May 12, 1949, the blockade was officially over, with a British military convoy promptly entering Berlin and the first train from the west, arriving by early morning. That day was marked by widespread celebration among the people. Upon his announced retirement, General Clay, the U.S. military governor, was honored with a salute from American forces and various aircraft. After returning to the United States, he was celebrated with a New York City parade, an invitation to speak before Congress, and a medal presented by President Truman. Even with the blockade lifted, the airlift persisted to ensure a substantial stockpile of supplies in Berlin, though the frequency of flights gradually decreased. By July 24, 1949, Berlin had accumulated 3 months' worth of essential goods to safeguard against potential future blockades. A remarkable achievement during the airlift was made by Flight Lieutenant Roy Mather, decorated with the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Force Cross, and his crew from 206 Squadron, who completed a record-setting 404 flights. The airlift operation formally concluded on September 30, 1949, lasting 15 months. The combined efforts saw the U.S. Air Force delivering over 1.7 million tons and the Royal Air Force over 500,000 tons to Berlin, totaling more than 2.3 million tons, a majority constituted by coal across nearly 280,000 flights. The Royal Australian Air Force also contributed by delivering thousands of tons of goods and thousands of passengers. Aircraft used flew a staggering distance in the process, equivalent to almost the distance from Earth to the Sun. This monumental effort involved pilots from the U.S., UK, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, and sadly resulted in 101 fatalities, mainly from accidents not involving flight operations. Financially, the airlift expenses were shared between the U.S., UK, and German authorities in the occupied western sectors, ranging from $224 million to over $500 million at the time, which would equate to billions today.